Hello, my name is Paul Kolb. I'm Research and Publications Officer at the Alamire Foundation, a music research foundation attached to KU Leuven. You are listening to an episode of the Studio Forum on Central and Eastern Europe of KU Leuven. In these podcasts, we invite academics to present their latest and most exciting research on the region. I'm joined today in the Department of Musicology at KU Leuven, both of whom have been involved in research on Central European musical repertoires and cultures. David Burns studied music at Merton College, Oxford, and completed his doctorate in 2002 on the polyphonic mass proper compositions of the Flemish composer Heinrich Isaac. After postdoctoral positions in Japan and Oxford, he joined the Leuven Musicology Department in 2007 as head of the Early Music Research Group. His research focuses on 15th and 16th century music, in particular on Heinrich Isaac and his contemporaries, interactions between chant and polyphony, source studies, and early music analysis. Isaac spent much of his career in Florence, but his long association with Maximilian I, King of the Romans and later Holy Roman Emperor, in particular as court composer for Maximilian, left a significant imprint on Central European musical repertoires, and thus Professor Burns' research has long had a special interest in musical interactions between so-called Western and Central European musical repertoires and cultures. Antonio Chemotti studied musicology in Cremona at the University of Pavia, where he received his master's degree in 2013. He completed his doctorate at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. His dissertation examines early modern polyphonic music for the Liturgy of the Dead. He was a postdoctoral researcher at the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, where he was working on the musical culture of early modern Silesia. He also held postdoctoral positions at the University of Vienna and the Villa I Tatti, the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies in Florence. In 2022, he took up a joint position as Assistant Professor at KU Leuven in association with the Alamire Foundation and work leader at the Royal Library in Brussels. In particular, Professor Chemotti's research on Silesia focuses on the interaction between different cultures, musical, religious, regional, and political. Perhaps we could start off with both of you explaining a bit about your research of Central European music and musical cultures and what you find so interesting about it. David?
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Paul. Actually, a lot of my research has been based on in or around Central Europe or Central European music traditions, beginning with my doctorate, beginning with the composer Heinrich Isaac. As you mentioned, he was a composer from Flanders, but he played a very central role in bringing Central European music traditions up to date. That was one of the reasons that he was hired by Emperor Maximilian at the end of the 15th century. And although he didn't actually seem to spend all that much time in Central Europe, he wrote a great deal of music which is associated with Central European traditions. And that was what I worked on. And since then, with that as a starting point, I still work on Heinrich Isaac. But since then, I have also worked on manuscript sources from Central Europe, usually ones that contain Isaac, but other things as well, and other composers who are associated with that region. And I've been particularly interested in more recent years with this question of interaction, with this question of Central European traditions and their relationship to maybe southern ones or also in particular Flemish ones. I had a project concerning this with a colleague in Prague, and I continue actually to work on Central European sources. For example, I'm working right now on a source which is in the Czech Royal Library, Czech National Library, and it contains, amongst other things, unique works by Heinrich Isaac, but also other pieces which remain to be studied.
Antonio?
Well, thanks, Paul, also for me for the kind of introduction. Well, my interest in Central Europe is also connected a little bit with the development of my academic career. When I was a postdoc, I would just apply to any job that would pop up, and then I got a job in the Polish Academy of Sciences in Warsaw, so I could discover a musical repertoire connected to the area, which for me was totally unknown, because having studied in Italy, of course, the focus of my studies, I always focused on Renaissance music, but the focus in Italy lied, of course, on the Italian music tradition with some excursus on France or other so-called center of the music of the time. So I had no idea. I mean, I knew that Central Europe, a certain part of Kingdom of Bohemia, Kingdom of Poland existed, but I had no idea about the music repertoire associated with them. So for me, I was really like very inspiring discovery to get to know something which was for me entirely new under the guidance of local specialists, and I'd like to single out Professor Pavel Gansarczyk, who's been my supervisor during those postdoctoral studies. And back then I focused specifically on the region of Silesia, which is now belonging to Poland, is the region around the city of Wrocław. But in the 16th century, it was part of the Kingdom of Bohemia, which is a very interesting region because it was a borderland territory. It is still. So you had really a meeting point of different cultures, of different music traditions. Not all of them are equally represented nowadays in our modern narrative of European music history. So for me, it was really the chance to get to know so much music that I had no idea it even existed.
Thank you. Could I ask you both, what do you find so interesting about researching Central European Renaissance music?
Antonio's touched on, I think, some of the important issues. He portrayed it as if he didn't know, but in fact, there's much that none of us know about Central European traditions. It's long been considered somewhat marginal or peripheral for not really legitimate reasons. It's one of the reasons why working on Central European music traditions right now, with the fall of the Iron Curtain, new access to sources, a new kind of narrative about how music history could be told. Those opportunities to reassess what we thought we knew in the light of actually quite flourishing musical cultures that we're typically not aware of and which haven't really been discussed at all. That presents a great opportunity, I think, to the music historian.
Yeah, what I maybe would like to add to what David just said, it is particularly exciting for me, at least, the chance to get to know music sources, like I'm talking of music books, prints or manuscripts, that have not been studied so much yet because they've been regarded for so many years as, oh, well, they come from Central Europe, they're not so important anyway. And that's really, for me, extremely exciting because I prefer to spend my time with new music sources rather than reading pages and pages in secondary literature. And that's one of the projects we have been doing together with the Alamire Foundation in collaboration with the University Library of Warsaw, has been really studying some of the sources that are kept now in Warsaw. They have a very complex and fascinating history, and they are also connected with the Low Countries because they were produced in the Low Countries, but at some point they arrived in Central Europe. It's very exciting material which has not been looked upon because it was for many years in a library in Warsaw which was not so accessible for scholars working on the western side of the Iron Curtain. Now they are accessible. Now we have many contacts. We have a very strong partnership with colleagues in Warsaw, and that's now really the chance to work all together on this material.
It's also true that I think Central Europe is the region where most sources, new sources that we didn't know at all, appear. I can give at least 3 examples of this, including the source I mentioned that I'm working on right now. This was, it appeared out of nowhere in 1994. It was a huge choir book. It contains some pieces that we know, so it's interesting to see how certain repertory, for example, by very international composers like Josquin, also Isaac actually, how this music circulated. It also contains unique music that we didn't know about at all. 2 very large choir books appeared in the city of Brno, and they were kind of not lost, but they were in the city archive. No one knew about them. And these 2 are an absolute treasure trove. So we have the chance not only to reassess sources that we know, or that we at least had documented somewhere, but also new things keep appearing. And I think it's not the same in Italy. You don't get such volume of new sources appearing there, or in Flanders, for example, it's pretty well catalogued, whereas the things that, and those are just 3 cases out of the last decade or so, or few decades. I'm absolutely convinced that there are many more sources as well that are waiting to be discovered somewhere, or which are sitting on a library shelf that no one has looked at all. So there's a lot of we might consider virgin territory waiting to be conquered.
David, you mentioned that there are sources that contain some music that we already knew about, but that it also contains new music that we're less familiar with. This Central European repertoire, is there anything special about it for an audience that doesn't know very much about Renaissance music in particular?
There are distinctive genres and distinctive types which were not widely practiced elsewhere. For even the type that I worked on for my doctorate, the polyphonic mass proper, These were very central, or very important in the Habsburg Chapel, but in Italy, for example, almost non-existent. So there's that. There's also pieces in genres that we do know, but we just don't know those pieces. And again, to come back to Isaac, the source which is in the Czech National Library, it had a piece by Isaac, so a composer that we knew, but we didn't know that piece before, and it aligns very squarely with Central European traditions. In fact, it's based on a piece by a composer called Petrus Wilhelmi de Grudench, who was from Grudench and was a composer who built his whole career in Central Europe, but whose music in that region had an extraordinary longevity. The piece that Isaac used it as a basis for a mass. That piece was already quite ancient when Isaac did that, and that piece continued to be copied into the 17th century. So you find that the ways in which music is preserved are different in Central Europe from, say, the much quicker turnover of pieces that you might find in Italy in general, or in Flanders in general.
There are specific social, institutional constellations in some parts of Central Europe that enable the creation of very distinct genres. I'm thinking specifically, for instance, in the Kingdom of Bohemia, in the Utrecht context, you have this tradition of having male adults who are amateurs performing music during the liturgy, which is very different from what we have in Italy with the professional choir chapels. And these groups of male adults, of course, needed music that they could perform, and that there is a whole tradition of polyphonic songs, which might appear, let's call it, simple compared to the most complex compositions by court composers, but it's very distinctive, and I personally find it extremely fascinating. It just sounds really great. And what I also find exciting is that you have this kind of music, this sort of local music tradition, which is very characteristic, copied together in the manuscripts from the area with really very complex and very modern compositions coming from the most important music center of the time. So it is not like it's been portrayed in the past that certain communities in Central Europe were just peripheral, and so they cultivated this very local and simple style of music. In fact, they had access to both things, to both the hyper-modern and complex music, but they also wanted to keep this other type of music because they probably attached some sort of identity value to it. And this coexistence of two music worlds in the same books, in the same contexts, that I find very exciting.
David, you already touched on this in terms of discovering new sources, but what do you think now remains to be done in the years going forward?
Many things at a variety of levels, amongst other things, a decent cataloguing, a comprehensive survey of the sources that there are. There's also, in broader terms, it's currently the case that Central European traditions are still considered somewhat separate. To revise the kind of historiographical models that we use about Central Europe so that it is no longer treated as a kind of secondary or peripheral place, but is given actually a central place like Central Europe really should. That's a challenge which is still, it's underway. I have colleagues who are dealing with this or are trying to address it in research projects. There's one at Prague University, for example, called Old Myths, New Facts, I think, which has produced a great deal of literature which has this as a goal to examine these Central European traditions, but also to put them in a broader context and to make a history of, let's say, at least 15th and 16th century music, which really covers the whole of Europe rather than just the West, as it actually currently does. And if you look in, even in fairly recent general histories of Renaissance music, for example, there was one written by a colleague, Richard Friedman. It doesn't even mention Hungary or Bohemia or anything. It even mentions Japan, but it does not mention these places, and I think that's very telling and a situation which really is in need of remedy.
Antonio, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I agree with David. There's really loads to be done, and it's also the fun part of it. What I really think we need, and we are working towards it, is better integration of research networks among the scholars working on the region. Because you really observe, if you take Silesia, as mentioned, so Silesia, this region which is now Poland, used to be Prussia before, so if you look at the literature on Silesia throughout the last 200 years, you had a period in which scholars were very ready to recognize all the different strands of its culture. So if you take the 1830 Dictionary of Musicians in Silesia, you have articles on Polish musicians, Jewish musicians, Czech musicians, Silesian musicians, because it was a multicultural region. Around 1900, all the narrative on Silesia has taken an entirely national German perspective. It's been quite detrimental. When then Silesia passed to Poland after World War II, we have observed a normal consequence of this, that the most scholars working in Silesia were scholars who lived and worked in what is now Czechia and Poland. And that gave them the occasion to focus on other aspects of the musical culture of that region that had been silenced before. So they observed connections with Bohemia, connections with Poland that the German musicology of 100 years before didn't want to see or didn't see. So I think there's really, really the chance now to work really all together from the different perspectives, because the region is extremely complex. You can't look at it only from one side. And that's what we are trying to do, I think. We have many... David had several research projects with colleagues from Charles University in Prague. We have a current collaboration with the Polish Academy of Sciences, with the University Library of Warsaw. So it's really like a international group that involves scholars from very different regions, with different backgrounds, but with a shared passion for Central European musical cultures.
Great, thank you. Perhaps on a lighter note, are there any special experiences that you had while studying Central European music that you would like to discuss?
You eat very well when you go there, and it's not the reason I go, but nonetheless, and actually, everyone I've met, for example, from librarians to colleagues at universities who teach and musicologists there, have been extremely open, extremely willing. I feel like we do actually have a good network already. I mean, it's fairly recent. It's not so long ago that, for example, at conferences you would meet people from Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic and so on. Now we do. That I find special. Yeah.
Antonio?
I just feel so welcome. Especially in the library, to be honest. Like I feel when I work on... can you imagine? I'm Italian, and I moved to Poland, and I went to the library, and I wanted to study these things. I have experienced in my own country, in Italy, a lot of, can you call it protectionism? Mm-hmm. Manuscripts were not given to me in Italy because there's someone else working on it. So it's not a obvious thing that you, as a foreign scholar who comes with foreign funding to study the local music sources, it is not automatic that the local institutions are so welcoming. But they were very welcoming with me, and they are welcoming with everyone who's interested in these materials, and that I found it really, really special.
That welcome is also something I've experienced from Central European scholars, and perhaps that's a good place to end. Thank you both, David and Antonio, for your time, and I look forward to hearing and reading more in the coming months and years.
Thank you.
Thank you.